In 1985, he was recruited into an offensive counter-espionage operations unit, 06101, in the National Intelligence Service, responsible for the penetration of hostile services in the frontline states. After the detonation of the Pretoria car bomb, a new Special Operations Unit was created in the Chief Directorate Covert Operations of the NIS, designated K44, into which he was recruited. This was a deep penetration small teams unit, which specialized in close-in surveillance of high-value targets located in hostile areas. He went on to serve in several special operations as the Cold War shuddered to an end, fundamentally changing the regional strategic landscape. All NIS operations were of strategic importance, literally shaping the journey that South Africa followed from conflict to democracy, only made possible by a deep understanding of the major drivers of change taking place on a dynamic risk landscape. He became a founding member of the South African Secret Service, where he served as Staff Officer and Divisional Head C11 in the Chief Directorate Covert Collection and Counterintelligence. In this role, he developed the first intelligence model of water as a national security risk, for which he became internationally known through diplomatic liaison between friendly services. He resigned from the South African Secret Service in 2003 and accepted a senior leadership role in the Council for Scientific Industrial Research, or our CSIR, while serving on the board of directors of a civil engineering consulting company. He eventually served as Deputy Governor of the World Water Council, became a professor in the Center for Environmental Management at the University of the Free State. Tonight we'll hear of a deep penetration operation conducted by K32 from November 89 to February 90 that was tasked to verify whether the USSR was indeed collapsing as the Cold War ground to a messy end. The answer to that strategic question informed the decision to launch the negotiation process that ultimately saw the SADF disengage from Angola, the implementation of UN Resolution 435 in Namibia, and the creation of CODESA as a platform for negotiated constitutional reform. With that, can you please welcome Anthony?
Okay, good folks. Good evening to you. It's a deep pleasure to stand before you tonight. And I just want to mention before I go into my texts what a profound journey it's been, because as a member of a deep cover, deeply secret organization where we were never allowed to speak and silence was our security. We never broke cover. If you broke cover, it was bad news. And in my process of immigrating to Australia, I've had to systematically break that cover. And it was quite a cathartic experience, because this whole thing of being cloistered by this top secret security classification that I used to carry was extremely restricted. And I found it extremely cathartic when I was submitting my papers for immigration to Australia. And I made full declaration of my role in the National Intelligence Service. And it was somewhat of a catharsis. So tonight I'm giving a talk, the first time I've ever spoken in public about this specific kind of operation. I've given some other talks recently, but I've been mandated by some of my colleagues. And in fact, tonight I met a colleague here from National Intelligence Service. So there are amongst you, you might not have even known about it. So I'm going to work off a prepared text, if you don't mind, simply given the fact that some of these things are so extremely sensitive, and I don't want to get caught up in the moment and maybe say a little bit more than I should say or something like that. But I have declared fully to the Department of Home Affairs, and I'm very grateful for the fact that they were very sympathetic, and they haven't declared me as being hostile to the interest of the Australian government, and I'm thankful for that. So I'm gonna just start off by saying that when I was in the process of joining SAMVOA, prior to my immigration to Perth, it became evident to me that little is known of National Intelligence Service outside of the cloistered confines of the world of what I call the faceless few that served in its closed ranks. NIS was a significant player in the liberation struggle theatre of the Cold War. It was known to other services all over the world, both friend and foe. But it was not known to our own National Defence Force people. More importantly, as a veteran of NIS COVID operations, I've been mandated by my fellow veterans to tell the story of what we now call the faceless few, the people that served without knowledge by the outside people. Today we live in a bewildering world. Governments are losing legitimacy. Populism and nationalism are both on the ascendancy, as are anti-globalist sentiments. The democracies of the free world are showing signs of distress as the use of social media enables information to be weaponized. The world faces the threat of global economic meltdown, a recent pandemic that rewrote the rules of free trade, and an unfinished Russian-Ukrainian war that initially sent energy markets into shock and exposed the global vulnerability of food supply chains. Russia's presence has again been felt. Since its initial attempt to destabilize Ukraine in 2014, it has failed to meet its stated objective, regime change in Ukraine, more than 2 years after launching a full-scale invasion. I must say tonight that I'm fully aware of the fact that South African veterans have a very close relationship with Russian veterans. And I want to make a very clear statement that I distinguish the Russian citizen, the Russian veteran, as being different from the Russian government. These are two completely separate entities. I just want to put that on the record here tonight. So, as a former intelligence officer, I think about these things a lot. Literally, I wake up at night and I think about these things. Probably in a way that's different to most. I wish it wasn't. I wish I could just be like any other Okie, but I can't. Tonight I will share some thoughts on Russia, based on my direct professional experience in the final days of the Cold War. And I'll tell you about those final days. Let me give you some background. I was an operator in the 1980s and 1990s in what was then known as, I'm going to use the word now that we never spoke about, the Chief Directorate Covert Operations, known as the HDK in Afrikaans, CDCO in English, a specialized unit within the National Intelligence Service that had been created as a high-impact resource to be deployed in a focused manner wherever needed. In the late 1980s, several strategic events were playing out in the Southern African region, all of which created a risk landscape of extreme uncertainty. Most of you are deeply familiar with those times, having been veterans and having served in those very times, so I'm not going to go into those details. But I want to take you back a few years to December 1979. I'm going to give some dates that are important. December 1979, in distant Afghanistan, Leonid Brezhnev deployed the Soviet 40th Army in response to the Soviet Revolution that was then taking place in Afghanistan. The mission, defined by the Brezhnev Doctrine, was to destroy the Mujahideen and install a pro-Soviet government in Kabul. I've subsequently had the privilege of getting to know some of those Mujahideen, personal friends of mine, personal colleagues of mine. The Russians were in command and chose to fight as they typically do, by strictly following doctrine. That doctrine meant establishing air superiority and then enabling ground-based forces to penetrate defined target areas to capture designated towns and cities. The problem that they failed to appreciate at the time was that Afghan society is feudal, with power based in tribal loyalties found in villages, not in capital cities. In 1985, enter our friends, the CIA. We'll talk about them just now. The CIA introduced the Stinger missile systems to the Mujahideen. Before the Stinger, the Mujahideen had never won one set-piece battle against the USSR forces. After Stinger, they never lost one. Stinger became a game changer. The Russians eventually did the only thing that they could do. They could retreat while claiming some form of mission success. We know that was a farce because the USSR was defeated in Afghanistan, exactly as the Americans were defeated in Vietnam. Neither admit this defeat, but the reality is different. For both were clearly unable to achieve their stated objective, regime change. They were unable to do it. The significance of the defeat of the USSR in Afghanistan must be understood in the context of the leadership change in 1985, when a man called Mikhail Gorbachev came to power. He was faced with three significant crises that had major ramifications for the world in general, but South Africa in particular. So let me quickly just touch on what they are. Number one, The introduction of Stinger systems to Afghanistan made the protracted war technically unwinnable under the prevailing doctrine. So either adapt the doctrine or you're not going to win the war. So increasingly a face-saving response was required. Point number 2, the arms race, characterized by the Cold War, had completely drained the Soviet Union of all resources, with a legacy of radioactive pollution, a growing and existential threat that persists today. I got that directly from the mouth of Mikhail Gorbachev when I was speaking with him. Directly, that statement there. Most people are unaware of the fact, the legacy of the arms race in the Soviet Union. Point number 3, the fiscus was under persistent pressure to bail out state-owned entities, which had become so cumbersome and inefficient over decades of central planning to the point where it was simply unable to cope anymore. Gorbachev decided to adopt a radical new approach in which he de-escalated the tensions and reached out to the West, something that had been unthinkable during the Cold War. We all remember the famous Reagan speech in which he made the plea, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall." It was against the strategic background that we in South Africa faced a historic opportunity. The window opened. How long would it stay open? With the USSR busy imploding, the war in Angola changed dramatically as the Cubans could no longer be constrained. I've selected my words carefully here. As the Cubans could no longer be constrained. Most people think of the Cubans as a proxy force for the Russians, but this is very far from the truth. On the contrary, the Cubans, by which I mean Fidel Castro and his layer of elites, were deeply suspicious, profoundly suspicious of the Russians. They felt betrayed by Khrushchev during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and they were equally angered by the Americans during the Bay of Pigs incident. So the Cubans had a chip on their shoulder, but a big one. They had 2 chips. One thing, they felt that Khrushchev betrayed them by generating the whole Cuban Missile Crisis, and then by just agreeing to take the missiles away without ever informing the Cubans. So the Cubans were extremely angered by that. And they were also very angered by the Bay of Pigs, by the CIA. So they decided to embroil both those parties in long-term conflicts that they could control. And this is a little subtle part of the Bush War that people generally don't fully appreciate. The Cubans became increasingly active in Angola at the precise time that the Russian power started to decline. The precise date of their initial escalation, I'm talking about escalation now, was November 1975. And some of you might know of the Battle of Kifangondo. Most people won't know about it, but the Battle of Kifangondo was fought initially by the South African artillery forces up in the north of Angola. And the significance of that event was it was a clandestine mission that had been authorized by the CIA. And the CIA panicked and they abandoned the SADF troops to their fate. And that became a pivotal moment in intelligence circles from that moment onwards. That group of artillery men and a signaller, I just did an interview recently with a signaller that was there, they had to be rescued by the South African Navy, who up until that point in time had not been involved in the Bush War at all. The South African Navy launched a thing called Operation Rubber Duck, a very, very original name. And it was an important moment because the Navy uplifted every single South African soldier and they brought their guns back. They left nothing behind. But the Cubans used that event to escalate. And they said, aha, you can't trust the South Africans. The CIA aren't up to it. We've got to escalate. And they launched the thing which some of you might know about called Operation Carlota. And Operation Carlota eventually saw a rapid escalation of Cuban deployment into Angola. I've read numbers like up to 100,000 people over time. Cubans were deployed into Angola, a big number of people. In Angola, now I'm going to tell you something that in Angola, it was the Russians who were the moderates, restraining the Cubans for fear of escalating the Cold War into hot conflict. The Cubans were maverick. They were list for a fight. They wanted to just fight it out. It was the Russians that said, whoa, calm it down. There are rules of this game, you know. We don't want to go to a thermonuclear confrontation, okay. This reflected what was known at the time as the Kissinger Doctrine, that was designed to prevent escalation in a world of thermonuclear weapons. But after 1985, I've just told you about this thing that happened in Afghanistan. After 1985, Russian power was in decline, as was their capacity to restrain Cuba. So at the precise moment when Cuba was getting all jingoistic, the Russians couldn't put their foot on the brake pedal anymore, and the Cubans started going for it. This is an important element to understand. It was an unrestrained Cuba that triggered the final battles with the SADF in Angola, not the USSR. In June 1987, at the very time that the USSR forces were withdrawing from Afghanistan, Mikhail Gorbachev addressed the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Central to his message was a couple of important points. The one was the need to reform state-owned enterprises. If you know anything about South Africa, you know what state-owned enterprises are doing in South Africa, okay? Triggering what then became known as the Soviet Joint Venture Law and the Law on State Enterprises. And these are two important pieces of legislation, boring and stuff, but important piece of legislation, because they open up a whole lot of things that is being dealt with today. These two laws had a profound impact because they invited Western corporations into the USSR, but they also enabled the oligarchs to capture the core assets of the SOEs. That's going to happen in South Africa now. As South Africa collapses, the SOEs collapse, our oligarchs are going to emerge. Effectively nationalizing the liability, taking the liability off the balance sheet, okay, and just capturing those core assets without any liabilities. Both became vital in the decades to come. Unbeknownst to him at the time, Gorbachev had initiated a series of reforms over which he ultimately had no control. This is where NIS became relevant. In 1987-88, some of you were present in those battles, during the big conventional battles along the Lomba River, known today as Operations Modular, Hooper, Packer, Excite, Hilti, and others. The Cold War shuddered to a halt in Africa. You saw it happen if you were there. The highly aggressive, while this thing is shuddering to a halt in the background, the highly aggressive Cuban 50th Brigade was unable to go onto the offensive into Namibia. Its intention was to go onto the offensive into Namibia. Its logistics line proving vulnerable to sabotage by SADF special forces, demonstrated during extremely sophisticated operations such as Abduct 1 and 2 and Drosti, to name a few. There are many other operations as well, where those logistics lines were sabotaged. FAPLA, along with their Cuban and Russian advisors, became holed up in underground defensive positions at a place called Quito Cuanaval, unable to advance on Jamba, and almost overnight, a window of opportunity opened for South Africa. FAPLA was tied up, Cuba was tied up, Russia was tied up in their bunkers in Quito. Our artillery was pounding them, they couldn't move. And that was the opportunity now, because now what is happening to Russia? So this window of opportunity was defined by the following. And now I'm going to tell you some things that you haven't heard before. Point number one, the penetration by the Chief Directorate Covert Operations, my unit, of the command and control line between Havana and Manong revealed the fact that a faction in Cuba wanted a face-saving way to leave Angola. That's hot inside intelligence. And it's a subject of a whole other talk if you want to talk about it some other time. Point number two, with the real prospects of Cubans leaving Angola, in other words, if a whole bunch of them wanted to get out of there, South Africa was also prepared to consider withdrawing. But South Africa was also dealing at that point in time with growing internal unrest in South Africa. So it was spread as thin as Marmite on your early morning breakfast toast. Point number three, South Africa was prepared to implement UN Resolution 435 and grant Namibia its independence, something that had been on the back burner for a long time. And point number four, with the USSR no longer a factor, this provided a potential opportunity that was unlikely to repeat itself again. Now this is an important moment. Within this milieu, NIS had been operating. The Chief Directorate Covert Operations, of which I was then a part, was directly involved in many of the successful special operations being run in the background. special military operations. You know what you heard those words coming out of Russia today. These can be thought of as enablers for the big event yet to come, a negotiated ending of the armed struggle. Could the armed struggle be brought to an end through negotiation, because it was unwinnable by both sides? It was unwinnable for a number of reasons. Time and space preclude me from elaborating on details of what was happening in South Africa in 1989, but as I said, many of you were there, so I don't have to elaborate. For those interested, I've recently submitted a paper for publication that deals with those times. Within NIS, an innocuous organ had been created. It was named the Special Work Group, SWG, and I found myself seconded to it, ostensibly representing the operational interests of the Chief Directorate COVID Operations. Each subunit had a representative on the SWG, and I was the liaison officer for K32. This was unusual, because the norm at that time was strict compartmentation of all offensive operational subunits, with a rigid application of the need-to-know principle, but absolutely rigid. If you break that rule, you're out of there. Boy, you're either out of there or you got bangles. For the first time, I began rubbing shoulders with members, fellow operators from K21, K22, and K31. We'd heard about them, we didn't know what they looked like, we didn't know what they were doing. Suddenly, I got to meet them. The SWG consisted of a handful of operational members of the Chief Directorate COVID Operations, tasked collectively with developing the intelligence foundation for a big event that the public was yet unaware of: the negotiated conclusion of the armed struggle and the creation of a new constitution through a process that would come to be known as the Convention for a Democratic South Africa, CODESA. That handful of operators were the initial surveillance spearhead that would eventually give South Africa a new constitution. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because there were many stumbling blocks in the way as that new landscape of risk started to open up. Navigating that uncharted landscape of risk was the raison d'etre for the Chief Directorate COVID Operations. It was the very reason that the unit had been established in the first place. We made extensive use of highly trained operators, often deployed in small teams, capable of functioning with minimal assistance in foreign hostile environment, independent of any embassy support. That was the important thing. In fact, it was the anticipation of the total loss of embassy representation that played a core role in the creation of the Chief Directorate in the first place. Those specialists were tasked with answering specific questions, defined in technical terms. I don't want to get into all the jargon, but as outstanding elements of information, OEIs. The audience needs to understand that when entering a new risk landscape, this is done with great consideration to the many ramifications of the operation. This is not a skopskit and donor thing. This is precision. This is laser surgery. You can't go into a foreign country and start doing things, without repercussions. The risk-reward ratio is carefully weighed up before a suitably qualified operator or team of operators is deployed, and plans are put in place to mitigate all the known risks. These are defined through a rigorous process of target analysis, which involved the definition of what was known as the essential elements of information, EEIs. Any intelligence person will know what those are. These are the things needed to solve a core strategic problem. In essence, the EEIs were a checklist of what we needed to know to derive an accurate answer to a question of national strategic importance. In an environment characterized by high risk and conflicting information, often coming from sources of varying reliability. It was the operator's task to explore the risk landscape, but to focus specifically on answering the questions defined by what it was that we need to know, but don't yet know. When you know what it is that you don't yet know, you are suddenly in a very powerful position, because from that moment you can start going onto the offensive. And that's what's happening in Ukraine today. In mid-1989, the big strategic question was whether we could realistically negotiate a peaceful end to the armed struggle that had waged for decades. This was highly sensitive, with a strict need-to-know restriction placed on all personnel involved. In the whole of NIS, maybe 20 people knew about this. That's how sensitive it was. Through targeted penetration, we'd learned that certain Cuban elites wanted a face-saving way out of Angola. The only time in my life I've ever flown first class was on that operation. when I had to go and debrief the source in weird and exotic places and get back to Pretoria in the shortest possible time. And I wrote my reports in the front, in seat number 1A of the front of the aircraft, writing my reports that I would hand over when I arrived back at Jan Smuts Airport. So through targeted penetration, we learned that the Cubans weren't as united as they thought they would be, or as they wanted to project. But one of the big questions was centered on the unknown factor of Russia. But what about Russia? Stated differently, we needed to verify whether Russia still had the capacity to project power outside of its borders in the face of the disintegration of the USSR. In short, as the USSR was fraying around the edges, would Russia send tanks to Berlin or Bucharest as they had done to Prague in 1968? Would Russia interfere with Odessa should we decide to go the negotiations route? Did they have the capacity to derail or influence the process? It was against this background that I was deployed in 1989, and my family's here tonight, and I'm very glad that they're here tonight because I'm holding myself accountable to them, because they had no idea where I was going and what I was doing. So I'm holding myself accountable to my son and to my wife here tonight, and I thank you for being here. So it was against this background that I was deployed in 1989. Applying strict operational rules for personal and national security, this deep penetration operation made use of the third country principle. This means that my country of temporary residence, where I was staying, was different to the country where I was operating in. So I was living here but operating there, and that's an important principle in this professional world. In fact, all efforts were made to avoid detection by the service of that country. Intelligence services are smart. They've got feelers out and they've got sensors out, and they pick it up very quickly. So we did a huge amount of our effort was avoiding detection. For our actions were not against their own national security interests. We were looking after our national security interests, but we had to operate out of their soil into the target country. I found myself at what had then been, and now it gets interesting, the point of Cold War contestation for virtually my entire life, the Berlin Wall, during the latter part of 1989, December 1989 it was. It was there that I was confronted by the stark difference between reality and illusion. The illusion had been deftly portrayed that the USSR was so strong that the Iron Curtain was impregnable. This illusion was a powerful one, underpinned by sophisticated propaganda, showing the fate of those who tried to escape to the West. And any of you that have ever visited that place, you would have gone to Checkpoint Charlie, and you would have bought a CD or a video or something showing what happened to all these people, these poor unfortunate souls that tried to cross the line. They were shot up or eaten by dogs or savaged or whatever, okay? So this is all part of the propaganda saying, this is impregnable, you can't get through here. Kippy, we were there. The first time I saw that wall was during seething protests that would put South African protests to the shame. Arguably, the most imposing part was the Brandenburg Gate, standing like a stark reminder of the bitter combat in 1945 that left the city under rubble from door-to-door street fighting, mostly by the Red Army, to be later divided into different sectors controlled by the Allied forces. It stood there in 1989 as a splendid reminder of the resilience of German architecture in the face of the sheer destruction of Soviet artillery firepower. I found myself reflecting on the gravid presence of the many souls departed at that one place, now standing like a stark monument dividing the East and the West. When I first saw the old Kaiser Wilhelm church, it's a spire at Kurfürstendamm, bombed out during the war, but now a monument, I could not help but be deeply moved. I offered a silent prayer and asked for strength for me to complete my own mission. This was the front line of the Cold War. This is where spies had been swapped for decades, and this was where the myth of Soviet might was tested in the most public way on a precise date, the 9th of November 1989, when it was announced that all border checkpoints between East Germany and West Germany would be opened. Note, I say the myth of Soviet might. Without one shot being fired, fueled by miscommunication, that myth was debunked as the reality of Soviet power became apparent for all the world to see on 9th of November 1989. I recall the sense of utter amazement. Kippy standing there utterly amazed, gobsmacked. My whole life I've born into this thing that the wall is powerful, and the East and the West, and Russia and NATO and wara. And yeah, without anything happening, people are just flying across the border without a shot being fired. So I was gobsmacked. I had to pinch myself and say, is this really happening? I was literally gobsmacked as I learned of one of the border guards, a gentleman named Harold Jaeger, in command of the Bornholmer-Straße checkpoint, trying to contact his superiors for orders, ringing on the little telephone. What do I need orders? Things are happening here. I need one. What must I do? And because there was nothing coming back, he ordered his staff to open the boom and allow people to pass without checking their papers. He later became a controversial figure because some accused him of being a coward for ignoring the eventual garbled orders to allow GDR citizens out but not back in again. He went down in history as the man who let people move freely rather than opening fire against them. Communists have judged him harshly, while freedom-loving individuals have mostly forgotten his name. Over that weekend, around 2 million people crossed the border from the GDR to West Germany, shattering the myth of Soviet invincibility forever. In one instant, 16 million people were liberated from the persistent fear of the Stasi, the East German secret police. Years later, 1994, 1995, when we were busy with our amalgamation, we reached out to the German intelligence service and we learned about Stasi. And we did some things that we learned from the Stasi to prevent what happened there from happening in South Africa. So we had a good relationship there. A year later, German unification had irreversibly altered the entire game of the Cold War. But now it gets interesting. Deep within the KGB office in Dresden was a career officer named Vladimir Putin, dealing with the fallout from the collapse of the USSR, taking a cue from Romania, where an angry mob had successfully stormed a regional headquarters of the Securitate. The Securitate were the equivalent of the Stasi in Romania, very, very powerful organ of state, and the public had risen up and they'd stormed this office and they'd overthrown the office. And I recall seeing images of an officer down and a member of the public urinating on this body. So what I saw and what Vladimir Putin saw were the same things, but we were at different sides of the fence and we were reporting this up the line. So Vladimir Putin is standing there now. On the 5th of December, 1989, an attempt was made to storm the Stasi office in Dresden. So the same thing, what had happened in Romania, the local East Germans tried to do the same thing, rise up against the Stasi. And they were marching down towards the Stasi office. And right next door to the Stasi office was the KGB. And close by was this KGB office. And confronting the angry crowd was a man, Vladimir Putin. He warned the leaders not to storm the building, saying if they did, they would be shot. The crowd hesitated, and Putin gained control momentarily. Putin then did what all Russians do. He phoned for orders. He needed orders urgently. So he phoned the KGB headquarters in Moscow, but nobody answered. Undeterred, Putin then found another solution, and he phoned the commander of the Red Army tank unit, calling for protection should the crowd return. This is precisely what we were looking for. Evidence of the Russian capacity to respond in the face of a disintegration of the satellite states comprising the USSR. Would the tanks roll in as before? Putin received a curt response that the tank unit could do nothing without orders. Because, and here the words are, Moscow is silent. With those 3 words, our OEI was answered. Russia had lost the capacity to project power outside of its territory. It could deploy the tanks if it wanted to, but someone had to make a decision and communicate the decision, and there was all of those little bits and pieces that weren't working properly. So Russia did not respond. So For us, this was the moment of triumph, even if we did not yet fully understand the details. And in fact, we didn't understand all the details at the time. It was confusing to us. Learning much of this later, you can go and look at all these dates, and there are lots of material out there about that now. All that we knew was that the citizens had revolted, and both the Stasi and Securitate had been overthrown, but the KGB office was still intact and possibly still functional. More importantly, Gorbachev had not authorized the deployment of tanks, and even of greater significance, he met with Chancellor Helmut Kohl in December of 1989 as the unification of Germany was cemented, thus ending the bitter division of the Cold War. What had defined my entire life went up in a puff of smoke, just like that. In my isolation at the sharp end of deployment on a deep penetration covert mission, I had witnessed the ending of the Cold War that had defined my entire life. I honestly didn't believe my own eyes. I had to literally pinch myself and say, can I write this stuff down? Are the people going to laugh at me when they read this stuff? Am I making a fool of myself in writing this stuff down? Putin was later to describe the breakup of the USSR as the biggest tragedy of the 20th century. He returned to Moscow even as Gorbachev was being ousted by a military coup that brought in Boris Yeltsin, the colorful politician who joined the popular uprising when the tanks were shelling the Duma. It was this pattern that characterized the collapse of the USSR, most notably the intervention of the security forces on the side of the revolting masses against their former masters in government. And in fact, if you know anything about the Romanian uprising, the flag of the uprising became the national flag. And in the center of the national flag, there was the crest of the Communist Party that had been cut out. So it was the national flag with a hole in the middle. And the security forces started flying that, and the security forces started protecting the people. The security forces switched sides. They did it in Russia, they did it in Romania. So this is highly relevant today in contemporary South Africa, where there's a growing likelihood of another internal revolt should the government of national unity fail. And I continue as a professional, retired professional, to look with much interest at what's happening there. And who knows, I might write something about it sometime in the future. I returned home in about February, March 1990, emaciated. My trousers wouldn't fit on me. No matter how much I tightened my belt, my pants fell off me. Consumed by the rigors of operational deployment in a foreign hostile environment, but with a personal observation that there was no tangible evidence that Russia still had the capacity to project power outside of its own borders. The USSR had simply disintegrated, and the most secure hard border of the then known world had succumbed not to tanks and artillery, but rather to confused guards, unwilling to give the order to use lethal force in the absence of clear instructions from above. The myth of Russian invincibility had been laid bare. The young KGB officer named Vladimir Putin was busy setting himself up to be named by Boris Yeltsin as his heir apparent and the future legitimate leader of an isolated and eventually demoralized Russia that was being overwhelmed by Western corporations. McDonald's was taking over Russia, not armies, and hollowed out from within by the billionaire oligarchs. But more importantly, we could proceed with Cadessa, safe in the knowledge that external interference from Russia would at best be feeble, but unlikely. There was interference from other places, and that's another talk for another time. I distinctly recall my return journey in a South African Airways jumbo jet, in which I felt safe for the first time after months of lonely deployment. What made my return home so poignant for me, besides the sheer joy of feeling safe once again, was the fact that sharing my flight was a large contingent of ANC SACP exiles returning home. I was just one of the people in the plane, and they were all up there singing and doing what they normally do. I recall the bizarre disconnect of my last image of what was then Jan Smuts Airport as I departed a few months earlier on this mission. That was my last place of safety for many months, but it was under the orange, white and blue of the South African flag, that flag there. The new reality of seeing the red flag of the SACP flying at home of what was to become Oliver Tambo International Airport made me instinctively realize that I had witnessed a historic transition. Absolute. I had to really think about this thing. I slipped through customs with as little fuss as possible, eager only to see my family once again and decompress from the relentless demands of a deep penetration covert mission. I now return to the present by sharing some thoughts that I gained as an intelligence officer who found himself deployed into what was literally the last moments of the Cold War. This was the final demise of the USSR that we were aware of in NIS after the big battles raged in Angola in 87 and 88. The first insight that I wish to share is the absolute myth of Russian invincibility. In my professional life, I had the privilege of meeting with Mikhail Gorbachev in person on a number of occasions. I can even say that I got to know him, his wife, and his granddaughter, a red-haired granddaughter whose name I can't remember, as really good Menschen, really good people, good human beings. I even got to know two of his advisors with which we shared many, many moments. I never got to meet Vladimir Putin in person. We were both intelligence officers of similar rank, deployed on the front line of the Cold War. We both experienced the tumultuous events underpinning the demise of Nikolai Ceausescu and Erich Honecker, strongmen of Soviet socialist republics. In the process, I've come to realize, exactly as was reported to NIS at the time, that Russia was, and still is, a mythical force. It had lost the capacity to project authority into the world in a way that is consistent with the international rules-based system of government enshrined in the United Nations Charter and underpinning the many legal instruments relating to sovereignty and the rule of force way back in the 1980s. So I've chosen all of those words very carefully. I believe every one of those words to be true. It has only sustained that. It doesn't mean to say it hasn't got power. It's got lots of power, but it hasn't got power to affect change in a positive way. It's got negative power. It's got the power to break and disrupt and destroy, not to create. It has only sustained that myth through the sophisticated use of propaganda and what is best described as asymmetrical warfare in the digital age. Donald Trump has helped sustain that myth. After trying to effect regime change in Ukraine in 2014, it is no closer to that objective today, even after escalation to full-scale invasion in 2022 that has resulted in more than 2 years of brutal, meat-grinding battle against an increasingly resilient enemy. As we speak, Ukrainian forces are capturing parts of Russia. I don't know if you've been watching this, but as we speak, it's happening quite fast. Don't let bluff and bluster fool you. Don't become confused about the physical size of Russia as the largest single country on the planet, covering 11 time zones, as the single largest country on the planet, covering 11 time zones, speaking over 100 languages. We've got a problem in South Africa with what, 12? 100. Don't confuse all of that with real power. Many large countries are in fact weak powers. It's the sheer size of the surface area that makes it impossible for a central government to project authority over the entire geographic area that we call the sovereign state. In Africa, we have excellent examples of very large countries also being the weakest in terms of projecting authority outwards. Think of Congo, Sudan, Central African Republic, all massive in size, yet militarily and economically weak. Russia is no different. It's a massive country with an economy the size of Texas or Spain. Go and look at the numbers. Think about what this means in terms of capacity to sustain a protracted war on multiple fronts. Think of what that means. Hubris is not the same as empirical reality. These are two fundamentally different things. When the leaders start believing their own propaganda to be true and they start making decisions based on their own propaganda, that's when the wheels start coming off. So the second insight is related to the capacity of any state to convert new ideas into cutting-edge military technology and then develop a supply chain capable of industrializing those new weapon systems. Yes, it is true that Russia has hypersonic missiles, for example. It's also possibly true that NATO forces might not have the capacity to intercept such weapons. Note I say possibly because we don't know this as fact. What we do know is that the Ukrainian armed forces have not succumbed to a brutal Russian onslaught and are currently on the offensive inside Russia. More importantly, we also know that the capacity to get missile launch platforms close enough to make a difference is limited simply by virtue of the depleted capacity of the Navy and the Air Force. Right now, Russia is unable to get a Navy close enough to Ukraine to make a difference. If it has failed in Ukraine, why would it succeed in America or in Australia? Let us assume, for argument's sake, that Russian hypersonic missiles are really a game changer. Let us then compare this with Nazi Germany, a truly industrial nation, in constant search of the so-called Wunderwaffen that would alter the outcome of the Second World War forever. Germany was always more technologically advanced than Russia, and even it was unable to find that single game-changing weapon that made a difference to the outcome of the war. I would venture to suggest there is no single game-changing weapon, unless maybe a nuclear bomb, I don't know. But it's very rare to find a single game-changing weapon. It's about the soldiers, it's about the deployment, it's about the logistical lines, it's about the tactics and the strategy. That's what that counts. It's not the single weapon. I ask a logical question about how an economy the size of Texas or Spain, riddled with corruption from top to bottom, riddled with corruption, and vulnerable to sanctions aimed at critical components like the semiconductors and other items needed to control hypersonic missiles with precision, will be capable of converting new ideas into sophisticated weapons of war in numbers big enough to make a difference. Those hypersonic missiles are not intercontinental ballistic missiles. They don't go up into outer space and come down. They go horizontal at fairly low altitude at extremely high speed. Now, and they evade incoming signals. They evade electronic warfare. Where's the electronic warfare people here? They know what we're talking about. So how can you get your electronic circuits to sense what's happening and to send a signal out to a flap on a wing to change the trajectory of the thing moving twice or three times the speed of sound? You need sophisticated electronics that needs semiconductors and sophisticated computing systems. You've got to buy those things, sanctions on all of them. They don't exist. So I don't believe they can make these things in numbers big enough to make a difference. You can make 1, 2, make 10, maybe make 100, but you're not going to change the war with it. Simple logic tells me that this is impossible. When that same army was unable to sustain a logistics line capable of capturing Kiev, and in the last week has been unable to respond to an invasion by Ukrainian forces that has now, as of this afternoon, captured approximately 1,000 square kilometers of territory, 28 villages, and is now going towards Kursk, the place where the large tank battle took place in World War II. So, if they couldn't do that, where's this myth? The third insight is related to the core weakness of any authoritarian society, where people are afraid to tell the leader what he doesn't want to hear. And this, I suspect, lies at the heart of the problem. We have seen this pattern repeat itself many times. Effective military leaders always surround themselves with experts capable of giving them genuine advice, typically from dissenting views. Those of you that know SADF, you will know Jan Breitenbach. Jan Breitenbach would give his opinion about your operation very quickly, and he would tell you, the mistakes that you've made. You need brash, hard people like that, and you don't get that in an authoritarian system, you see. Authoritarian leaders are intolerant of dissent, and so they are seldom given information that differs from the strong opinion already held about a given topic. Too many people are falling out of high buildings in Russia or succumbing to poison to create a safe enough place for senior officers to point out a critical flaw in any plan of the autocrat. Saddam, Hitler, and Putin were all unwilling to hear dissenting views, and so their plans remained inflexible and ultimately failed. You'll notice I used the past tense for that statement. The fourth insight is related to the depth of resentment that the citizens of the former USSR states have towards the Russian government, and that includes Russians themselves. Remember that the tanks were inserted into Prague precisely to suppress a popular uprising in 1968. The feeling that ordinary citizens have towards the Russian government are not one of warmth. On the contrary, I would go so far as to say that the Russian government is feared by the citizens of the former USSR, even to the point of being hated, but not necessarily listened to. We must not make the mistake of believing that a leader in one of those satellite states, Lukashenko, for example, represents the best interest of the citizens of that state. To understand this, we must think differently about Russia as a medieval society based on a strictly enforced feudal hierarchy. Think feudal, think medieval. Putin has forced order onto an unwilling populace, but in so doing he has empowered what used to be known as the boyars, now known as the oligarchs, who are nothing more than rent-seeking feudal warlords. They are gangsters with luxury yachts, meting out the most primitive justice imaginable, stealing from the government, and they are certainly not popular in their own sphere of interest. Fifth, we need to ask whether an embattled Putin will resort to nuclear weapons. Now, this is a vexing question. The answer to this is not a simple one. If Putin was a rational actor, then he would know that any use of nuclear weapons would immediately result in overwhelming retaliation. And this is where it gets interesting, because in a rational actor model, you would have different checks and balances in the chain of command, and they would act as check and balance. In America, you have the nuclear football. So, I would argue that Putin is not a rational actor. And this is the problem when you insert into senior decision-making positions your cronies, your buddies. I don't know if you know this, but General Shoigu, the former general officer commanding, was not a military-trained officer. I don't know if you know that. It's a question of verifiable fact. He was, in fact, a shaman. He's a shaman. He was Putin's shaman. So he's not a formally military-trained officer. He didn't go through staff college and learn all the tricks of the trade. Just to give you some insight, and you can go and verify that. So, in this regard, we need to take comfort. Comfort from the fact that the billions of dollars invested into the most sophisticated intelligence operations known to mankind, all targeting this one single issue. By this I mean that the combined intelligence services of NATO and the rest of the free world will have penetrated the Russian chain of command at multiple levels. I'll go on the record today as saying that what I see happening in this current Ukrainian incursion into Russia tells me that the Ukrainian intelligence service has deeply penetrated the FSB, deeply penetrated it. It is acting on inside information. It's not that service is completely permeable. I'm convinced of that. So the question that I ask is, if NIS could do it to Cuba in the 1980s with our meager resources at our disposal, then so much more can the CIA, MI6, Mossad, BND, Australian Secret Intelligence Service, and other sophisticated services do the same. These are big boys. These are big boys. These are the real mana. These are the real guys. They've got real budgets behind them. A high probability exists that NATO governments will know long before the strike is ordered. The analog here is the famous case that occurred during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when a GRU officer known as Colonel Oleg Penkovsky defected to MI6 and provided the affirmation needed to reduce tensions by closing the gap of uncertainty. You can Google Oleg Penkovsky, it's a well-known case study. Penkovsky was eventually assassinated, for Russia does not tolerate defectors. But the citizens of the free world owe him a huge debt of gratitude, even if the average person has never heard his name today. How many of you have heard of Oleg Penkovsky? I don't know. Today, I'm convinced that many Penkovskys are being handled as witting sources by NATO intelligence services. I'm convinced of that. And from those high-value sources, governments will get what they need to know to protect their citizens. I've got absolutely no doubt, and one of the leading services there will be the Ukrainian service. Of that, I've got no doubt. Finally, where the Russian government excels today, and this is on their good side of their balance sheet, is in the field of asymmetrical warfare. Russians understand asymmetrical warfare better than anybody else. Their security services, most notably the FSB, have perfected the art of targeting the single most important aspect needed for any democracy to thrive: the free flow of information in an uncontested way. The very strength of democracy is based on policy choices at election time, and that requires an informed electorate. By carefully targeting voters through the precise delivery of micro-messaging, information has been successfully weaponized by the Russian state. These memes you get all the time, those memes, they all come from those troll farms. Conspiracy theories erode the legitimacy of any elected government, in extreme cases resulting in the questioning of the integrity of the election itself. Does it sound familiar? We see this playing out wherever the Russians have a strategic interest, like in the USA and Britain. Frankly, I know of no security structure in the free world capable of successfully countering this threat without eroding the oversight role that is vital to any democracy. In conclusion, this is the end of the road now. I'm proud of my operational service as an intelligence officer. It's been a cathartic experience, and I wish to thank the Australian government for giving me the opportunity of actually coming clean when I put on my form, and I attached my papers, and I said, yeah, this is what I was trained to do, and I feel liberated, free at last. It's quite an amazing experience. In NIS, the faceless few were part of something way bigger than any of us as individuals. I like to think that we made a difference, and we developed deep insights into complex strategic matters that impacted on the daily lives of millions of people. We served with integrity, and we asked for no recognition in return. If ever I get invited back here, I'll talk about another operation that impacted on the lives of maybe 40 million people in Southern Africa, as most people have never done anything about. But if it's an open question. I'm going to close off by saying our motto was ab obscuro in apertum, from darkness into the light. And I thank you all for bringing me, for allowing me to bring part of this story, this dark story, into the light tonight, to tell the story of the faceless few. It is an enormously rewarding journey, and it's something that I cannot find the words in my vocabulary to thank you enough for. So I thank you, Samvoa, I thank you all, and I certainly thank the Government of Australia for giving me that opportunity and for making full declaration. I thank you very much. I'll gladly take any questions if you've still got.
I do my research in AI, and all I see now is misinformation. I can't watch YouTube anymore. It often keeps me up at night, in the same way you're talking about the sort of second half of your speech. Do you think it is such a real risk?
I think, I'm a man of empirical fact. The empirical fact is at no time in the evolution of human history has all known recorded history been available to the fingertips of any individual with Google. You can Google almost all knowledge that's recorded. So at no time in our human history have we had more availability to information. And at no time in our evolution has it been more necessary to reach consensus over policies and strategies and tactics to protect our self-interest than now. And yet now we've got the least opportunity or the least capability of reaching the consensus that we need. And I'd say there's an inverse relationship between that. And I think one of it is this whole thing about these alternative facts or these false narratives that are put out, disinformation, active disinformation that's put out, that's bombarded the ordinary person that hasn't got formal academic training. They don't know what to believe anymore. So they believe what they've been told. So we're living in this dystopian world today. And unfortunately, the very power of democracies is at the most vulnerable point of that democracy is the free flow of information, in particular at the time of transition from one leader to another, from one election time to another. That transition of power, uncontested, is of critical importance, and that is what is being extremely successfully targeted. If ever we get another talk, we can talk about this asymmetrical warfare and how it's done, because it's extremely interesting to know just how sophisticated it is. And I
continue to not sleep at night.
Well, I lament the fact that the constraints of democracy, the oversight, requires to not act in the way that we need to act, and that's the way that. Yeah. So I hope I've answered your question. So we're playing with fire, but that's what's made human beings. We've got this. In my generation, I was completely moved by the fact that an American president said, in my lifetime, we're going to put a man on the moon and bring him back safely. The Apollo program completely captivated me. It changed me as a person. It made me what I am today, the Apollo program. So we can believe these things, and I don't believe that AI is necessarily good or bad. It has the potential for both. So how we handle it, how we use it, is going to determine the outcome.
Anthony.
Yes, sir.
My son's the CEO of a mining company based in South Africa.
Yeah.
The recent South African elections scared the bejesus out of a lot of mining companies.
Yeah.
The threat of nationalisation. Do you see that as a realistic risk for people who've got great capital in the country?
That's a long and complex answer. I'm going to give you the simple question. The reason why I'm living here today is because I am firmly of the opinion. I'm firmly of the opinion that we are going to see an armed insurrection in South Africa, and I'm firmly of the opinion that the government policies at the moment, we live in a failed state scenario in South Africa, and I'm really deeply, profoundly concerned, in fact, by the role of Russia. And if you look at what Russia's done, is cut a deal now. It had a deal with the ANC. It was always a long-term ally of the ANC, and it's now cut a deal with the MK party. And the MK party used to be the armed wing of the ANC. That's now an opposition political party, so it's backing both horses. So, this is a disruptive force. And I firmly believe that there's the potential there for great uncertainty. But I'll gladly talk to you off camera about that, because I happen to know quite a lot about that space, and I'll gladly talk to you about it.
Tony, I was always curious about the composition of the Cubans, the percentage. I have a personal deep source from Angola. Of blacks. Apparently Castro sent a massive, when he sent his soldiers, he said mainly the black guys of Cuba. Is that sort of true? Or?
Look, I don't know that level of detail, I don't know, but all I know is that I'm currently being harassed by a Cuban, actually by a Venezuelan journalist. He'll harass me tomorrow, because I'm going to put this thing up on Facebook eventually, and he's going to harass me again tomorrow. These people have got very, very dogged views about the whole thing, and they refuse to believe that they didn't win the war, and they refuse to believe, there's all kinds of really deeply dogmatic issues there. But I think Cuba, when they sent their conscripted soldiers, didn't necessarily send. No, I don't want to use this. I want to be sort of sensitive. The cream. Yeah. Well, that could be. But it was the same with the Americans when the Americans sent their GRs into Vietnam. Same sort of thing, It wasn't necessarily the rich people that cut the deal. In fact, if you look carefully at the Russian society, there's actually a deal done in Russia where the elite in Moscow and in St. Petersburg, that elite that keeps the current power regime in power, they are not affected by these things. So it's a very selective process of conscripting soldiers, and I think that's part of the weakness of it. But I mean, ultimately, the Cubans fought, I think, very well. I don't know of any South African soldier that isn't quite respectful of the Cubans. I think the Cubans really earned a name for themselves as soldiers, and I'm not in any way opposed to what they're saying. But like the Russians, I mean, there's some really good Russian soldiers as well. We've met some very good ones through Operation Bratva, really, really, really good guys. And they've got the same problems that we had. So I think ultimately it comes down to the leadership. The leadership and what are you fighting for? Why are you out there, in this meat grinder? For what reason? For the whim of the leader. So this is where it all falls apart.
So you spoke quite in detail about Russia having 11 different languages, 100 different languages or whatever. What is your take on China being an authoritarian country, and what influence do you think it will us in Australia down in the Southern Pacific over a period of time?
Okay, I must give a caveat. I'm not an expert in any way on Russia, on China, but so that's my caveat. But what I do know about China is they are extremely thoughtful people. They've got a deep culture going back thousands of years. It's an authoritarian culture. You cannot manage so many people in an open democracy. It's just too messy, it doesn't work. So China, as far as I'm concerned, is a rational actor. They will not get involved in anything that is high risk. They're just not going to do that. All China's got to do is carry on doing what it's currently doing, and it's going to become the biggest economy in the world. It doesn't have to go to war. So I think this whole notion now that Russia and China are big allies, and they're going to go to the BRICS Bank, and they're going to create this new thing that's going to break the petrol dollar and blah, blah, hanakiri, wara. I think all of that is, frankly, just that's pie in the sky stuff. I don't think it's going to happen. I think China is a very serious player, but I think they are rational actors. And the interesting thing about China is, my understanding of it is that they're not really a naval power. They don't have a deep history of naval forces. So the capacity to deploy a naval force is something that I think is quite interesting to study. They're more land-based soldiers, and there they've got numbers on their side. They've got massive numbers, but once again, they've got the economy on the side. Ultimately, to wage war, you need an economy. And if your economy can't carry you through, and Russia made the mistake of saying, oh, they're going to stash all their money away and they're going to hoard gold and do all kinds of things because they believe sanctions are going to come. Well, all that money's been depleted. It's either been stolen or it's been misallocated on something else. You've got to have a cash flow. And those of you in business, you'll know, if your cash flow isn't healthy, your business isn't healthy. And if you can't sustain a modern army that consumes fuel and ammunition and equipment and manpower at the rate that it does today. And so it's all ultimately comes down to the relative power of the economy. And I don't see that that China has to become an aggressive military power. I don't see it.
Anthony, just an interesting observation. Ukraine has been going on for 2 years now, with the might.
Since 1914, since 2014, yeah.
But if you look at the so-called might of the West, pooling all of its capability, they should have walked through Ukraine and into Russia in the second month. They haven't been able to do that.
Okay, that's a great question.
America's got its own issue. It's facing bankruptcy, and it is massive issues at home. And America is currently divided by people that are the original, the Republican people that are Constitution, do your military service, do all the other things, but they've been undercut. There's this undercurrent of communism, Marxism, socialism that's eroding the fibre and the fabric of the American society.
Okay.
It's going to be a big challenge in the future as well.
Okay, that's a great question, and there are lots of sort of permutations to that question. So the first question is, NATO is a powerful force, and I know some people say that NATO is an evil force. I know, I'm not going to get into that argument. NATO is a defensive thing, and it's been extremely successful. It's prevented thermonuclear war, and what I've just said now is the essence of why they haven't allowed it to escalate in Ukraine. Because there are rules that determine how these superpowers, the former superpowers, engage with each other during a thermonuclear period. So I mentioned earlier on the Kissinger doctrine. The Kissinger doctrine defined the rules of engagement that Russia also played by. They had the Brezhnev doctrine. And the Brezhnev doctrine and the Kissinger doctrine dovetailed into each other. And what they essentially said was that neither of those two countries can get embroiled into the war of anybody else. They can support somebody, they can let weapons go there, but they can never escalate it to a point where those two face off against each other, because then there's this risk of a thermonuclear confrontation. So we mustn't misinterpret the fact that that NATO forces haven't given enough equipment, or they've been reluctant. They've been reluctant to escalate into an invasion into Russia. But if you look carefully now, that is starting to change now. I mean, in the last month, I've been reading about Germany saying that they're quite prepared to actually put troops on the ground, boots on the ground in Ukraine. And we're also hearing, Britain is starting to talk like that. America has already got the equivalent of the Wagner group. So these are mercenary private military corporations that are active there. So I think, as we see this thing playing out now with Ukraine at least capturing a piece of Russian territory, I don't think they're going to ever hold it forever. That's not the intention. I think they're simply saying, listen guys, you've taken from us, we can take from you. They're demonstrating their power, and I think ultimately they're forcing an internal crisis of leadership that is eventually going to probably depose Putin. That's probably what's going to happen. And there's going to be some internal coup, because it always happens by internal coup. It's messy and it's nasty, but it's an internal thing. It's bad for business, for the oligarchs, etc. They sort it out internally. That's done. And then we've got to hope that the new leader is maybe not as bad, or at least more willing, like Gorbachev was, to engage. So these are very nuanced things that you've got to understand. But there's no question of doubt that if you just take this very fundamental calculus, the size of the economy that supports any war. The USSR has crumbled. It doesn't exist anymore. Russia is the only significant country there now, and its economy is relatively small, relatively unsophisticated, relatively undiversified compared to other countries. And you mustn't confuse the fact that if you go to Moscow or if you go to St. Petersburg, the city itself is beautiful and modern. But you go 100 k's out of there, and you're literally into a place where people living in villages with chickens clucking around. They're ploughing with horses. They're peasants, absolute peasants, you know. So we mustn't confuse those things. I would go so far as to say, I'm very conscious that there's a camera still rolling, but I would go so far as to say that probably one of the single most sophisticated special operations ever run in a covert world was the Donald Trump operation run by the FSB. I'm convinced that this will go down in the textbooks of special operations in the future about how it's done. It's the most audacious use of covert intelligence capabilities in a kind of semi-open way. You know, we can see it, but it's secret. It's we've got plausible deniability. But we deny all knowledge of this, but we all know that you know, that we know, and you know, and blah, blah. And there's that little sort of nudge, nudge, wink, wink thing, okay? So Russia is extremely sophisticated in that space. I'd even go so far as to say that if you look at the Brexit story, the whole Brexit story was driven by this very same thing. Also will go down, in my professional opinion, as an extremely sophisticated Russian special operation. Why? Because why target Britain? Britain is a member of NATO. Britain is a member of the European Union. Both NATO and the EU are pivotal for Russia's interests. So if you can target Britain or any of the European countries, then you can start driving wedges in, and you can start undermining the whole European Union. So I think the Brexit thing was a brilliant example of the weaponization of information through the use of social media and the use of the very sophisticated AI capabilities. So the fact that you can monitor people's social media, Facebook, for example, or whatever, Twitter, whatever, you can monitor people's opinions about certain subjects, and you can get a very accurate micro sort of analysis of what that group of people is thinking, and you can start targeting information specifically there. And you find a lot of it's to do with psychological views and psychological sensitivities and a proclivity towards conspiracy. If you've got a slight paranoia in you, then they simply amplify that. So what they would look for something that is extremely divisive in society, preferably something where there's a 50-50 division. They don't care what it is. It could be abortion, it could be whatever, a common market, whatever. But they look for that divisive issue. And as close as you get to a 50-50, that's what they want. And then they just amplify those two voices, and they micro message into that space, and then they start getting the friction going. So they start dividing. So this erodes the very foundation of democracy, and this feeds into that answer what I gave you just now. That I don't know if democracies are able to survive this kind of thing. Deep inside me, I believe that democracies will ultimately be able to rise to the occasion. But you're going to see a lot of internal jiggling and finding for solutions. It's going to be a period of extreme creativity for democracies to survive this, I think. But I do ultimately believe that if you look at the two, it comes down to a pool of ingenuity. What is the pool of ingenuity held by Castro and his leadership clique? What is the pool of ingenuity held by Putin and his leadership clique? What is the pool of ingenuity held by the swear word in America, the deep state? The institutionalized democratic systems, deep state, thousands and thousands of people, deep knowledge. So how do you balance those things out? And I believe ultimately the adaptive capacity of democracies is such that it's probably going to fall down in their favor, I think. But it's going to be a very rocky road. So it's not going to be an easy period of time. Okay, folks, thank you very much. I think I've outstayed my welcome. One more question.
One question. From your experience, how do you see the Israelis doing deep penetration operations into the neighboring Arab states?
We modeled ourselves on the Mossad. We looked for proxies as who were the best, and we modeled ourselves. I'm talking about the Chief Director of Covert Operations now. We modeled ourselves on the Russian KGB Directorate S, which is the illegals operation. That's a 30-year career officer that goes into another country, but a deep 30-year operation. And we just didn't have the time to do that. We had to operate, within months, maybe years. So the Israelis have got the capacity to do that very quickly, but they take no prisoners. The Israelis are extremely ruthless, extremely aggressive, and we became aggressive, but we used what was known as controlled, focused aggression. So our controlled focus aggression was against the enemy, not against the collateral damage. So we were extremely sensitive about collateral damage, and there's a whole lot of stuff I can talk about that. But the Israelis are exceptionally good at what they do, exceptionally good. But now, having said that, there clearly been some shortcomings. You know, that recent uprising, that recent attack on that festival clearly showed that there were some very serious intelligence. Yeah, very serious intelligence failings. And you'll find that the funny thing about intelligence, you have to be right 100% of the time. Whereas if the bad guy only has to be right sometimes. And that's the difference, you know. So I think there clearly have been shortcomings. However, having said that, what now happens in a professional service, and the Israelis are extremely professional, they would go back and they would do an internal post-mortem, and they will figure out what went wrong, and they will ruthlessly correct what went wrong. So they will adapt very rapidly, and they will sort out what's going to happen. But frankly, I wouldn't like to be living in that neighborhood. It's a very, very unhappy, very unpleasant neighborhood. Very vulnerable, yeah. But they're extremely capable people. Okay, guys, thank you very much for hearing me out. I appreciate it. So thank you.